So just to briefly introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Naomi Nicholson, and I'm a founding trustee of the Institute of Regulation, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. I've spent most of my career in the civil service and in regulators, mostly in healthcare and education sectors. And latterly, I've set up on my own independently, supporting regulators and also carrying out research with objective actually into good practice in regulation. So if you're interested in that, do take a look. And I'm really interested in our theme today, back to basics. Because as regulators, we are often pulled in so many different directions, and we have to get it right. Complex and high stake systems rely on us to get it right. So I'm really fascinated to hear from our panel today about how they've walked that particular tightrope in their different regulators. So, a few housekeeping items before we get started. So we're recording today's session and we'll send a link out afterwards. We'll also be taking questions for the Q&A section of the webinar today, and you're very welcome to submit questions throughout the discussion in the chat. Hopefully you know where that is. I think it should be on the top or the side, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. And there's no need to take frantic notes because we'll provide key takeaways along with the recording, so you can just enjoy the discussion today. So our agenda, you can see that on the screen. I'll take a few moments just to cover the work of the Institute before introducing our panel facilitator, Paul, from our webinar hosts Objective. Paul is then going to introduce our three fantastic speakers for today's presentation, and then we'll go into our panel discussion. And as I said, if any questions come up during that time, feel free to add them to the chat. We'll come to them at the end, and we'll come to as many as we can, and then we'll wrap up, and we're aiming to finish at 1 o'clock. So yeah, feel free to have your lunch during the session as well, no problem with that. So I just wanted to say a few words about the Institute before handing over to Paul. So I don't know, you might be a member or your regulator might be a member, or maybe you've not heard. The Institute is a UK-wide network of regulators that really aims to support good regulation across the UK. And we were established as a membership organisation in 2021. And the reason I joined as a founding trustee was really because, I'd worked in regulation for many years, and I really felt that, we as regulators could learn so much from each other and could do with more support in the sector. Maybe had good relationships in our industries or with our government departments, but actually across regulators, there wasn't really anything like that. So the Institute really is a professional network, and we aim to be the home of good regulation in the UK. So we provide professional development and training in regulation, and we support good regulatory practice across the UK. And we're open to all regulators to join. Individuals can also join, including those who work in regulators, academics, and regulatory experts. And it's been actually really exciting to be part of the Institute's growth journey. We started off with, I think, less than 20 regulators, and we've got almost 60 now, plus affiliates and individuals. So we run a variety of events, online webinars, free courses, longer courses. We also hold a really wonderful annual conference every March, which I'd recommend coming to if you haven't already. You learn so much from there. I know I have. We also have network groups on lots of different areas in regulation, including on equality, which I run, areas also like enforcement, legal, policy and risk. And these are great groups, really safe spaces for discussion of the issues that we encounter. So if you'd like to find out more, just do a quick Google or get in touch with the team. So coming back to this webinar, I'm really pleased that the Institute is working with Objective to support this discussion on good regulation and work through some of the challenges here. And I'm delighted to introduce Paul Levoy from Objective, who's hosting today's panel discussion. Paul is managing editor of The Modern Regulator and leads regulatory content at Objective RegWorks. With a background in journalism, research and public policy, Paul has worked with regulators across many sectors for more than a decade. His career spans editorial leadership, technology analysis, and regulatory storytelling, which I love the idea of, with a focus on helping public sector organisations share knowledge, navigate complexity, and stay focused on the outcomes that really matter. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Again, it's called Back to Basics, Refocusing Regulation on Core Principles for Better Outcomes. And as Naomi just mentioned, I'm Paul Levoy. I'm managing editor of the Modern Regulator, which some of you may have heard of. It's an independent publication that's devoted to covering what goes on in the world of regulation in between the headlines that most of the mainstream press will cover. We cover the interstitial tissue and talk to regulators all around the world. So I encourage you to check it out if you haven't seen it already. I also oversee regulatory content at Objective RegWorks, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. We're thrilled you could all join us. So taking a step back, why are we talking about back to basics in regulation? Well, as the regulatory landscape becomes more complex with all these new technologies, evolving frameworks, and also mounting public expectations, there's a big concern that we drift away from the fundamentals from time to time. So today we'll explore what it means to return to those core principles, why it matters, and how regulators can do it effectively. And we're very lucky to be joined by 3 expert panelists, and they all bring deep practical experience to this conversation. I'll introduce them one by one. To start, Nick Granger, OBE, is Chief Information and Financial Officer at North Sea Transition Authority. Now, Nick brings a rare combination of strategic, financial, and digital leadership to regulation. As Chief Information and Financial Officer at the North Sea Transition Authority, she plays a central role in enabling the UK's energy transition through effective data-informed regulation. She's also a champion of innovation. Nick has led multiple digital transformation initiatives while staying grounded in the principles of good governance and public value. She was awarded an OBE for her services to digital transformation as well, and I'm pleased to welcome her today. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Paul. Thanks.
Dr. Colin Sullivan is the Chief Executive of the Human Tissue Authority, where he leads the UK's regulator for human tissue and organs with a strong focus on ethical integrity, public trust, and regulatory clarity. He had prior senior roles at the Food Standards Agency and the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and he brings extensive experience in navigating complex, high-stakes regulatory environments. His leadership emphasizes proportionate, risk-based approaches that support both innovation and core public protection goals. Nice to see you again, and thanks for joining us, Dr. Collin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Great to be here. Thanks.
And finally, Karen Walker is Director of MP Services, Strategy and Change at IPSA, where she oversees the delivery of support and standards for members of Parliament. With a background in public service delivery and change leadership, Karen has led strategic transformation efforts while ensuring regulatory transparency and accountability. Her work always reflects a deep commitment to balancing innovation with the fundamentals of effective public service regulation. So welcome, Karen, as well.
Thank you.
Now, to start, we're going to open this panel conversation. I'm going to lead with a question directly to you, Colin, and then invite the others to chime in as it feels right to you. But firstly, to get to the core of this, how have regulators drifted away from the core principles of regulation over the past decade? Colin, do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. I think that's a really important question, and I think there's quite a few reasons for why it can happen and why it has happened in some cases. First of all, I think it could be down to a weak or a poorly defined framework within which the regulation occurs, or there could be a strong and a legislative framework in place, but there could be weak adherence to it. Mission drift can occur, I think, due to influence and pressure from external agencies, the prioritization of new activities over statutory obligations arising from perhaps a directive or a combination of government demands or industry pressure, lobby groups, public opinion, They can all compromise or redirect focus from the core principles, the establishing principles, as it were. Or it can be just an influencer wants something done about an issue, and then that pressure is put on the regulator to go beyond their remit. Or drift might happen because of a change in calibration amongst those within the regulator. Those who undertake inspections, audits, or other regulatory activity. It could be down to personal preferences of an individual, a senior individual, or a senior team in the regulatory function within the regulator. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be the harms may have changed. The evidence might point to that, but rather than have a process leading to a change in the framework, the regulatory activity may consciously or unconsciously drift into an adjacent space. Or the harms could be the same, but the tolerance of risk might be lower. That might be due to an adverse experience that the regulator has encountered, perhaps some negative publicity, and perhaps therefore a tendency to do more rather than less, and to be less precautionary. It might be down to different interpretations of junior staff. That might be down to training deficits or due to their personality, perhaps a fear of missing things, or equally being over-enthusiastic, resulting in a tendency to do more than is necessary. And organizations, regulators themselves, may take comfort by doing more in a space. They might want to go the extra mile as a way of avoiding criticism, or they might see it as a way of securing their future, of becoming indispensable. But of course, that might, of course, have the actual opposite impact, as it may result in criticism of them being a burden. So, and often a regulator can find themselves in the middle between different points of view and being criticized for being ineffective or for being a body that stifles innovation and growth. So overall, I would say it's really important to be on the front foot. By that, I mean being very active in considering what you're doing as a regulator, actively regulating rather than passively regulating. I think that's important to avoid unintentional drift.
So for a whole host of reasons, very clearly, has that been your experience, Nick, if I can turn it to you?
Yeah, sure. So I would frame it slightly differently. I don't think we've kind of drifted away from the core principles of regulation, but I think as Colin said, the world has got more complex, and I think regulators have had to evolve to meet those changing needs in the market sector or area that they're regulating. So I think for us, it's much more thinking about how we can use regulatory tools in a different way to create and generate value in the sector that we're regulating, rather than perhaps worrying about any drift from where we started. So our role as an organisation has changed dramatically in the 10 years that we have existed, because the context has changed. So we're not drifting away from our principles, core principles of regulation, but we've had to regulate and pick in a different way and use different tools to do that. And I probably should have explained a bit about who the North Sea Transition Authority are for that answer to kind of make sense. So our role is to regulate and influence elements of offshore energy. Now, when we started, that was oil and gas. And as we've evolved and the context in the UK has changed, that has expanded to include carbon storage and offshore energy, so offshore hydrogen. So our role now is much more accelerating the energy transition whilst also ensuring the bits that we had at the beginning. So that's meant that our kind of core principles of how we regulate have had to change because the context within which we're regulating has changed.
Karen, have you seen drift yourself, and what factors do you think have led to that?
So I think in my space, I would say I haven't seen drift. And I think that's because the principles are actually at the core to our purpose. So IPSA exists to regulate MP staffing and business costs. So it's public money. It's really important to people, especially at the moment. We determine MPs paying pensions. It's a really critical, topical area that is quite contentious. And we provide support, so financial support to MPs to carry out their constituency and parliamentary work. So those principles are absolutely key to everything we do, but we've kind of defined our purpose around those principles. So our principles, for example, are value for money, integrity, accountability, and parliamentary purpose. So long as funding is spent in that way, it's compliant. So I think we haven't drifted from those principles because they're core to everything that we do. I can see why other organisations may have done. Times change, and I think regulation changes over time as well, and I'm not sure we kind of acknowledge some of that. I think so long as you're steadfast in your purpose, the risks and tolerances do change over time, but if those principles are core to everything you do, then it's your guiding light, really. And I don't think there is a reason to drift. I get there are outside influences, but I think it's being strong and making sure you're doing the right thing for the right reasons at the right time.
Colin, both Nick and Karen had the opportunity to sort of sum up their organization's mandate, but I don't think you had the opportunity. So do you want to briefly tell the audience what you do at the Human Tissue Authority?
Yeah, very happy to. The Human Tissue Authority is a UK regulator for human tissue and organs, both deceased and living. And we regulate the use and storage of human tissue, mainly in healthcare settings, but also in mortuaries. So we are a small but quite diverse regulator established by the Human Tissue Act in 2004.
Right, that's excellent. So whether or not we feel that our organizations have drifted from our core principles, I think there's always an imperative to get back to the basics of what we do. Nick, what does back to basics actually mean to you? It's a sort of abstract, nebulous thing we use sometimes, but we know that there are very practical ways of going about it. Can you share what those foundational principles look like in your work and in your sector?
Yeah, sure. So our ultimate purpose is to regulate to create value. And for us, that's in three key buckets: energy security, making sure the UK has an energy supply, reducing emissions, so making that supply as clean as possible, and then accelerating the energy transition to net zero. So one of the key ways that we do that is through stewardship. So we work really closely with our colleagues in industry to help them meet their regulatory obligations, but also ensure there's a level playing field for all operators. So that can mean one-to-one stewardship, but also we convene workshops to promote best practice in operations and also provide quite a regular stream of guidance. So one of our founding principles, if you like, in a functional area is the obligation on operators to decommission wells in the basin. So as a regulator, we're creating the certainty on those obligations. And one of the ways we do that is through visibility, through using high quality data. So recently we've done a decommissioning data transparency project that puts data back out to the industry. So this is industry data they have submitted to us, and we are doing some analysis, but then sharing it back. And what we're seeing is that our kind of ever-growing supply of data is enabling the industry to make better decisions, and that enables innovation, which then in itself adds value through job creation as well. So I should say, when necessary, we use our powers of sanction to ensure that those kind of vital commitments are being met, and to demonstrate to the wider sort of North Sea community, investors and the general public that the North Sea is a good place to do business. But we're doing that in a way through ensuring that value is created through certainty, and then we're using that as a jumping board to generate innovation.
So data is obviously very important to the organization. From the outset, did you sort of find out what the core principles of the organization were and translate those into how that could be expressed as meaningful metrics, as meaningful data?
Yeah, sure. So we have core values, and I think some of them are very similar to the ones that Karen just talked about: accountability, being robust, fair, and also being considerate is one of our core values. We use those in everything we do. We have metrics which are industry facing, so one of them being emissions reduction. is one of our external KPI measures, but then we also have measures internally, as any organisation would do, to how we actually run our daily business. And for us, that's very much coming back round to those key values.
Karen, what does back to basics mean to you? And you mentioned your foundational principles. Can you make the abstract a little bit more concrete and tell us how they come to life in your sector?
Yeah, sure. So the public are really interested in what MPs spend money on. You'll see media every weekend about an MP's. In fact, there's some highly topical information in the news today, but you'll always see the public being interested, the media being interested in what funding goes to MPs and then how it's spent. So those basics for us are making sure that we're doing our job in ensuring MPs are spending money in the right way on the right things, and there can't be any perceived benefit for them personally. So this is very much for us about making sure that money is used for parliamentary purpose. There's some great examples around regulating newsletters, for example. Part of our principles are that there can't be any benefit for the party, there can't be political benefit, there can't be any campaigning in the materials that we would pay for. So it's really crucial that those 4 threads of basic principles are there in any of that spend. So we also rely heavily on data. We review spend, we validate, we do sample checks on the money that is spent, and you know, it is literally up to us to make sure, well, it's up to MPs to make sure that money's spent in the right way, and us to ensure that we can assure the public that that's the case. And I think over time we've changed the way we regulate. So we had a very rules-based, mechanistic approach to regulation, a 60-odd page scheme saying you can spend money on this, you can't spend it on that. There were it was very black and white, and actually we have gone back to basics, to those 4 principles, because the emphasis was very much on IPSA to decide how that money was spent, when it shouldn't be our decision. We should just regulate that MPs are doing the right thing. So those back to basics have been crucial for us to be able to change from rules to principles throughout everything that we do.
That's excellent. I don't envy being in the position of ensuring MPs do the right thing, certainly.
And the majority do, I have to point out, the majority do. But that's core to everything that we do, is making sure that the right thing is done.
I suppose, as with regulation, we tend to see the worst examples in the headlines, right? Colin, what does back to basics actually mean to you? What would the foundational principles look like applied in your work?
Yeah, well, when I think of back to basics, I go back to why we were created, and why there was a Human Tissue Act in 2004, and it was because of a number of public inquiries, because of events at Liverpool's Alder Hey Children's Hospital and Bristol Children's Hospital, where clinicians had been storing organs from children that they'd taken at post-mortem without consent, and parents were quite understandably shocked at what had happened, and several public inquiries and a retained organs commission led to the Human Tissue Authority. So it's really, I suppose, going back to basics, is why were you created? Is there still a need? And government took the opportunity back in 2004, when the Act went through Parliament, to give us a number of other responsibilities. For example, we approve all the living organ donations. So if you are minded to give a kidney to a friend, or altruistically to someone you don't know, that's about 1,000 of those a year in the UK, that will go through the Human Tissue Authority and be approved. But at the heart of what we do is the importance that human tissue is treated with dignity, and any activity around it is consented activity. So everything then spins out of that. The Act itself is really quite high level. It gives us a number of scheduled purposes, areas where we cover. But then we have then developed underneath that, and these are then laid before Parliament, codes of practice with standards in them. And then the standards themselves have some guidance. So there's a hierarchy of detail, if you like, which we will change, we will review from time to time as we feel that's appropriate. Interestingly, you don't have many cases now where clinicians are retaining organs. That's not so much of an issue. But you have other areas like security. You've got issues arising from abuse in mortuaries and so on, which were not envisaged when the Act was created. And that's where you do get into discussion about your coverage changing and does the Act cover for that? But when I think of going back to basics, it's about why were we created, and what was the driver behind it.
Yeah, that's very good. And it's also interesting to learn how it evolves over time, as I'm sure Nick and Karen have found in their own purviews. Why is it important now more than ever? And Karen, I'll lead with you. Why is it important now more than ever for regulators to return to those basics, those foundational principles? And what's at stake if we don't?
So I think I've said it earlier, things have moved on, and so the way in which we regulate has changed over time, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's weaker. It's different and often stronger, actually. So those basics in regulation create trust, and if you move away from those, then you've got the ability to destroy that trust, and that is, one regulator could do something that shreds trust in other regulators as well. So there is a knock-on impact. And I think there's such high scrutiny on standards out there right now. Public perception of those standards is really high. Trust and confidence needs to be there. And I think those things are the things that are at stake if it goes wrong. So, if you're not regulating, you're not a regulator. How can you assure the public that the right things are being done? And if I think back to IPSA, providing financial support to MPs so that they can carry out those parliamentary functions is core to what we do. There's a huge focus on that public money right now, and how it's been spent. So if there's a feeling of any weaker regulation or a change in regulation because we've moved away from those basics, it does create that issue with trust in regulation.
What about you, Nick? Why do you think it's important in this day and age, this context that we're in the world, to return to our basics?
I guess kind of following on from what Karen says, it's underlying issue at stake is public money. We're all trying to do more with less. So I think returning to the basics and actually seeing what assets we have and levers that we can use as a regulator to enable our industries to create value is really key. So going back to that sort of conversation around data, one of the return to basics for us is having high quality data that we can use to further our purpose. So I talked about emissions reduction being a priority. Yesterday, as an organisation, we issued our emissions monitoring report, which shows that the basin emissions are down a third since 2018. Now, that's a really important priority for the UK to meet net zero. So we've seen that the basin have to halve emissions by 2030. That's probably likely to be met, but we need serious investment as a country if we're going to meet the 2040 target of 90%. Now, I've just thrown out a whole load of figures at you, and the figures themselves aren't really so important for this conversation, but the important bit is how do we further emissions reduction as a country? We need the data to do it. And that's something where, as a regulator, we're uniquely placed to be able to collect that data, analyse it and push it back out to the industry, which can then enable us to regulate progress and monitor performance as a sector basin.
Colin, what about you? What about this world right now with all its overlying factors makes it more important than ever to return back to basics?
Yeah, and I think if we look at this from a UK perspective, we have the government wanting to push the growth agenda and really wanting to reduce any burdens that are unnecessary. And of course, back to basics is looking at, what's our core function and what should we be doing. And I think if you look at that, we need to make sure as regulators, we're not considered to be part of the problem, or rather we're part of the solution. And governance creation of the Regulatory Innovation Office, for example, is very much about trying to reduce the burden on industry and helping to promote growth. So it's really, I suppose, again, scrutinizing what you're doing, making sure that whatever you're doing is adding value. It could be adding cost. If it's not adding value, then you're likely to have lobby groups and political pressure to make changes. That has to be balanced, of course, by saying that there's a huge amount of regulation in the UK and elsewhere where it is adding real value and protecting people from harm. And from an industry point of view, being regulated by a respected regulator can be a hallmark of the quality of the organization. So I think there's a balance to be struck there, but I would come down to the fact that returning to basics, it's important because we've got to make sure we do what we need to do, but we don't overdo it.
That's great. Before I move to our next question, I'll just remind our audience that if you have any questions throughout, we do have some time reserved at the end to discuss those. So please feel free to submit them in the meeting chat. Colin, I'm going to lead with you on this one as well, but can you lead with an example that your own agency or another's agency, I know you've seen the work of a lot of other adjacent and non-human tissue authority organizations, that really helps illustrate what a successful return to back to basics look like? I think a lot of our attendees today would be looking for, concrete, actionable advice, yes, but also what it looks like when you do it successfully. So does anything come to mind? What has made it work?
Yeah, just a little bit of context before I go into the specific example that I could quote. So I think for me, it's about proportionality and being risk-based. And that's surely at the center of how we regulate. And if we're talking about the basics, I think that's going back to the basics is making sure that that's the case. Avoiding the harms, but also adding value. So I think of a 4-box grid in terms of the 2 parameters being benefit and burden. And ideally, you want to be spending your time and space in the high benefit, low burden activity. And you may need to do high benefit, high burden, but that might be unavoidable to cover the necessary ground. But you absolutely want to avoid low benefit and high burden, and probably want to also avoid low benefit and also low burden. So in the Human Tissue Authority, we've had a project entitled Innovation in Inspection. And what we've been doing is looking at the different tools and the different approaches that we have adopted. And we're trying to develop and have developed a number of more bespoke approaches. And that's primarily because we want to be proportionate. So we want to put our efforts where the needs are, where those areas of the sector that is less compliant is where we should be spending our time. So we've developed one end of the spectrum, virtual assessments and self-assessments. But at the other end of the spectrum, we've actually, you could say this is going back to basics, it's maybe a little bit old-fashioned. We've actually, at the other end of the spectrum, increased the number of unannounced inspections. So we've got that spread of activity, less intrusive and lighter touch in one end, and then more intrusive at the other end. And that's on the basis of the degree of risk, based on evidence and data, and the level of compliance and the number of shortfalls that we find. And what made that work? I think there were 2 things really for me. First of all, when we thought we would embark on this journey, we, as often happens, we decided we'd hire some external consultants to get some advice and to look at different approaches. We very quickly realized that the best ideas were from within the organization. And so we didn't retain the consultants. We drew upon the staff, and we decided to spend the resources we had available on our own expertise, on our own project management activity. And the other thing for me was the importance of leadership for any change that's developed. And that's not just the senior leadership deciding that this is a good course to follow and then determining that that's the way we're going. It's also about the leadership that those who are technically expert, because they are going to need to change their approach that they have hitherto been following. And it's really important to have their leadership and their commitment to making those changes, because you are taking risks, but you're doing it because you think it's the best approach.
That's excellent. Nick, can you share any examples of how your own or another's agency has demonstrated successful return to back to basics?
So we've already talked quite a lot about creating value, but I think one of the ways where regulators can kind of return to basics whilst adding value is looking at areas where regulators can add value through taking a UK PLC view rather than an industry who have perhaps got their individual objectives as organisations. So appreciating we're a industry economic regulator as opposed to one that deals with sort of citizens direct in that. One of our key priorities is accelerating the energy transition. So we looked at ways that we could enable industry to do that in different ways. In doing so, we created something called the National Data Repository. It's got over 1 petabyte of industry data in it. Now, the data is industry, they retain ownership of it. But what we can do uniquely as a regulator is consolidate that into one place and make sure we're reducing the burdens for industry on retaining that separately themselves, but also ensuring that people can access data that they perhaps wouldn't have had in the silos of data silos before that. So we've seen that being that data being taken, reprocessed and used for a successful ScotWind round. We've seen people using that data to train AI algorithms for the carbon storage round, which has led to potentially up to 10% of UK annual emissions being captured. So those are things that the industry have absolutely led in, but without us as a regulator saying, how can we enable that through providing this type of platform, it wouldn't have been possible. So I think for me, it's yes, returning to basics, but looking at ways that the regulator is uniquely placed to do things to support industry.
Now, just take a step back and underscore how monumental that is. Can you help us conceptualize a petabyte of data? Because that, to me, just sounds like a lot of data, but it's hard to concrete. It's hard to understand the enormity of it like that.
Absolutely. So I should say that kind of data we're holding is about rocks and maps. So if that gives you an idea of the types of data, and we're holding about 16 years of HD Netflix movies. So you could watch our data if that was possible for 16 years before you ran out of something to choose, which I think just gives it an indication of, as you say, the volume of data that's there.
Right. Karen, can you think of any examples you can share where your own agency or another's agency has really captured that return to basics movement?
Yeah, and I think Colin summed up as well really well the proportionality and the risk-based nature of regulation and the kind of spectrum. So trusting and allowing and empowering people to do the right thing, but making sure they are, and then when they're not, applying the right sanctions. You can imagine that setting up an office, employing staff, travelling to Parliament, working from 2 places, etc., which is the role of an MP, is really, really hard to administer the funding for. So we use a reimbursement model, for example, currently. So MPs will spend and then claim the money back. They have a payment card, they need to reconcile it. So what we've been doing is working to remove all of that hassle and removing that admin burden from MPs to make sure they can focus on what really matters, which is running the country, making laws and, really, really important things. And I think where IPS has been in the past has potentially been in a position where actually we were quite arrogant about, you've got to do this to make sure that we're comfortable you're spending money in the right way. What we're trying to do now is remove all of that. So say to MPs, we can centralise services to avoid you needing to pay for them up front. We can create central invoices with particular organisations so that you don't have to get involved in the payment of those services. So really just reducing the amount of time spent on the admin burden of managing the funding is a real basic for us that we've gone back to.
Excellent. Now, Now, Nick, in the spirit of actionable advice that we referenced earlier, for those working in regulatory bodies today, for many of our audience, I'm sure, what are some practical steps they can take to refocus on the fundamentals? And feel free to draw on the experience at the North Sea transition, but maybe also think about how they might apply more generally.
Yeah, sure. I think Karen's teed me up really nicely on this one. I think removing admin burden, both for our own teams, but also for organisations and individuals that we are regulating, is a key place to start. So Karen's example, I think, is fantastic for this, but also looking at how you can automate regulatory transactions is a big thing for us. So we had a process that you need to apply to for us for certain consents to do with infrastructure and pipelines. It has historically done by paper. We had a colleague that would literally move the process along with a trolley in one of our offices to the next person that needed to be involved. Actually, if you can automate that and take out the manual work and the processing elements, it enables our team to focus on the actual regulation and the advisory elements internally, which I think also just makes everybody's working day better, right? So I would say if you're framing it as reducing admin or looking at automation, I think that's probably the first place people should be looking for some practical steps.
Colin, what about you? Practical, actionable steps that can be taken to focus on the fundamentals?
Yeah, for me, one of the things we haven't talked about is the relationship with our stakeholders, those that we regulate. I think that's really, really important. And getting that relationship right is core to being able to make whatever changes you think are necessary. So I think in terms of the regulator, you need to be active. You need to be on the front foot, not the back foot. I think if you're looking at what you cover and how you do it, it's about active regulation rather than passive regulation. I think it's very easy for us as regulators to slip into passivity, and perhaps agree an approach and then just assume that it's going to be okay going forward. But of course, we all know that things change and technology pushes the boundaries, and the frameworks that we're working to don't always satisfy the needs because they're legislation that may be a number of years old. And so you've got to be creative and work with what you've got, but try and be creative. But I think that's about relationships and knowing early some of the innovations that are going to be coming around towards you. And so important, I think, to be able to have as regulator and regulated an adult to adult conversation rather than a parent to child conversation. And I have been in a situation previously where there was more of a parent to child regulation model, and I don't think that works for either party. So I think it's about one practical aspect is really trying to get the relationships right.
Very good. And Karen, I know you touched on it in your previous answer, but any further thoughts on practical steps?
Yeah, I think the biggest and most practical step is simplification. So making it as easy for whoever you are regulating to comply with that regulation, examining why you exist. And I think Colin touched on that earlier as well. So making it as simple as possible for compliance. And a further example from an IPSA perspective is our core purpose. And we describe that as fair rules, wise spending and great service. And we regulate through that service. So we've just really simplified it internally to make it clear what we're there to do. And then we're obviously simplifying for our customers as well.
Excellent. Now, staying with you, Karen, for our final question before we move to some of the audience questions that are coming in. How can regulators, it's important to look back. Obviously, our foundational principles, as we've covered in this chat, are very, very important. But it's also important to look forward. The innovation versus risk balance is always a tough one to strike. How can regulators find that balance while staying grounded in core outcomes? What would you like to see more or less of in the years ahead?
I think regulators need to put that core purpose at the heart of any change. So why they exist needs to be at the heart of that innovation. So they don't need to be separate. You don't need to think about them as that's that's simple regulation versus we need to innovate. How do we marry the two? We've been transforming IPSA for the last 5 years to make it easier for MPs to get the funding that they need to do their jobs. And so our vision has really been about enabling MPs to do what really matters, as I've already said, and that's by providing a seamless regulatory service. So I think, people would talk about there needs to be some friction in regulation, but I'm not sure that there does. I think the more seamless you can regulate, the easier it is for everybody to comply. So in reality, removing that admin burden, for example, and the time-consuming nature of regulation for MPs means that we've been able to free up time for everybody, and we regulate heavily through that service and support. So I think we have invited in our stakeholders, our customers, to regulate and change the way we regulate with us. So innovating with customers, co-creating and co-designing some of the initiatives that we've created has been really important. And as we've moved from those mechanistic rules into that more principles-based approach, it's just been more proportionate and balanced and reasonable in what we've done and how we've done it. So I think we can innovate and go back to those basics, and they're just so intertwined. You don't move away from regulating how you do it in chasing that kind of creation and innovation. And we do a lot of support in that for our MPs, so helping them to help us to change and innovate, but always sticking to the core principle of why we exist.
Nick, the North Sea Transition Authority is no stranger to innovation, and we've discussed some of your great data initiatives. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on striking the balance between innovation and core principles?
Yeah, I agree with Karen. I don't think the two are separate. Yes, you probably have to sometimes balance doing what people will see as the day job and innovating and doing something in a different way. But I think the two are so integrated, it's really difficult to split them. But if you think about doing things in a different way, we've seen from all of the fantastic examples people have given today and elsewhere, you can reduce regulatory burden whilst also creating value and deliver for the UK and the sector as a whole. So I think they are intertwined, but it can sometimes be challenging to put the time aside to do the innovation part of the organisation's role. One thing we've piloted and tried is to give people dedicated innovation time, which is protected for that. So we haven't gone to the extent that you will have heard in the past about Google's 20% time and things like that, but we have said the last Wednesday of every month, the whole organisation has the time protected for innovation time. So they can spend that thinking about different ways of working, doing learning and development. And our leadership team, we try very hard to protect that time for people so that they can get that opportunity. And we've seen some really interesting things come out of that time. And I think it's just starting to create that culture that innovation's a good thing. It's good to take that step back sometimes and think about different ways that you can do it. But I don't think that's separate to being grounded in your core outcomes and principles.
I love the protected innovation time. I know in all of our roles, we see, especially in this realm of AI, we see all of these possibilities, but it's so easy to just maintain and get focused on the day-to-day and, oh, how would this distract? But to commit to it organizationally, I think it's a brilliant move. Colin, what about you on the balance of innovation and staying grounded?
Well, I'm not seeing a divide there, because I think innovation can help you stay grounded. You can do things differently through innovation, but it's still around the core principles. And I think that's indeed what many of us are having to do as our budgets are being reduced, and we're having to do more and have more touch points with those that we regulate with less resources with which to affect those engagements. So it is about finding time. I mean, I like what Nick has said about protected time. We've not taken that approach for innovation. We've created a project around which we've sought to bring innovation through that route. But that's an interesting one, and certainly one to think about. Protecting time, though, in order to be able to review your processes and to do deep dives and to go back. We're talking about back to basics, and what that means. For me, that means going back to first principles about what it is you're actually in business to do. So I think we certainly see value in being reflective as an organization and try to do that, because we're all busy people, and it's easy to just keep churning out the old approach, but that's not necessarily the best approach. And of course, with challenging budgets, it can be difficult. So I think there is a balance to be struck between how much time you can spend on preparing for the future and how much time you need to deliver the current regulatory model. But I think that's certainly something that is important when we're thinking about the balance.
That's great. We are in our final 10 minutes. Naomi, do you want to turn over to some of the audience questions that have been coming in?
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. That was a really rich discussion. I've been really enjoying it. We've had lots of comments, people saying they're enjoying it too. So thank you, everybody. We've had a couple of questions in about responding to the industry or working with industry. So one question about how have panelists responded to increasing complexity in the industries they regulate, and also a question about what roles regulators should have in supporting and promoting innovation within the sectors they regulate. So I thought we could take those perhaps together. Does anyone want to come in on any of those points? Shall I just invite Paul?
Oh, yeah. Why don't we lead with Karen, because she spoke last.
I think I still go back to simplify. So where things are getting incredibly complex, don't follow it. Just keep it simple. It's the basic of everything, and it just really helps you. It's back to core purpose. So what we're here to do, how can we do it in the simplest way possible, despite the fact the landscape keeps getting more and more complex.
Nick, any thoughts on that question?
I think it's really understanding your strengths as an organization so you can be agile and pivot when you need to. So when we were given new subsectors to regulate, if you like, the underlying regulation might be similar, but we need the team to learn in those new areas. So being able to pivot quickly when there's a change, as there is with all of us in all of the environment, right, I think is really key to being able to address those complexities.
Colin, what about you? Increasing complexity in the industries we regulate. What is your experience there?
Yeah, well, a number of reflections. First of all, I think it's really important to stay close to your those bodies that you regulate. There are within the regulated community that those that are highly compliant and very professional, and they're facing the same challenges as you are. So talking to them about how regulation might change and getting their ideas. I do think it's really good if you can have a system whereby people can move across the divide. And we have some employees within the Human Tissue Authority who've worked in bodies that are now regulated by us. I think that's really, really valuable. So I think that's it. That's the core of it. I mean, sometimes we have problems with our legislation doesn't cover particular activities, and then it's about the interpretation of that legislation, because it's very time consuming and over a long period before you get changes in primary legislation. So if there are gaps there, you need to have those conversations and see if there are ways that you can regulate or provide advice or have best practice guidance or whatever, so as to cover those areas. But staying close to the industry you regulate without being captured by that industry is that tightrope that you need to walk, and you need to do it really well and maturely and have mature relationships. Yeah, so I mean, I can think back when I was in the Food Standards Agency of having a conversation with a meat company. In the morning, we were talking about innovation and different ways of doing things. And in the afternoon, I was having the same conversation with the same people about prosecution. And you need to have mature relationships to be able to do that.
That's great. Naomi, is there another question you'd
Yeah,
like
we've
to?
got quite a few. We'll probably not get through all of them, but the next one that came in was an interesting one about how do you review whether your regulator has veered away from core principles? How would you notice a move away from your core principles quickly? Because, the question was asking, it feels like it could be something that could be hard to notice.
Yeah, maybe Karen, we'll start with you there. You mentioned at the onset of this presentation that you hadn't seen much drift. How would you think you would see it if it did emerge?
We'd have an incredibly busy press office. So we would get media inquiries, there would be public uproar at particular areas. And every now and again we get it wrong. And that's what has the propensity to land an MP in the press. So we would understand quite quickly if we veered too far away from regulation. The public and the media would notice straight away. We would notice as well. Obviously, we check our performance and measure our performance internally, so there would be indicators for us. But seeing MPs behave in a different way would be a classic for us to understand whether or not we've gone too far.
Nick, what about you?
So we're quite a small organisation, so I think for us we would start to see capacity pockets where people were at capacity, over capacity, because they were trying to do things that were outside of the kind of core principles. So I hope that we pick it up that way, as Karen said, also through sort of press inquiries and things like that. But I think the knowing your team and knowing where their work is lying at any time, and those pockets where perhaps there's a bit of overwork, I think is also a good indicator to look for in moving away from your core principles.
Colin, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think if it's slow, insidious change, it's not noticed. But if it's fairly radical, then those that you regulate will come back to you fairly quickly and object, probably reasonably.
Naomi, do you want to take another question?
Yeah, I don't know. Do we have time for one more, Paul?
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, I'm going to try and merge two again if I can. There's a question about, I guess one question about kind of looking backwards and looking forwards. So we've got a question about AI. What role does AI play in this? Does it help us get back to basics, or does it create complexity? And there's also a question about, is back to basics kind of just about regression? So something really about, is it, how does AI help us move forward? But is this about regressing? Questions around that.
Well, it wouldn't be a conversation in 2025 if we didn't discuss AI in some way, I suppose. Karen, I'll ask you to lead on that as well. Thoughts on AI, and also if back to basics is a form of regression, as one questioner put it.
So I think AI is really, really useful if it's used in the right way. And your data quality is where it needs to be in the first place, because using poor data in AI is just going to set you up for failure. So AI in my area of regulation, for example, would be really useful in terms of data and volumes and churning out information. I do believe that there is a firm need for human validation in there somewhere, particularly in the area that we work within. So I think AI's got its purpose and its use, but with care and caution to manage the risks. What AI does miss sometimes is context, and context is crucial. So I just think it's a blend of AI versus human connection and context. In terms of regression, I think the word back does that to you anyway. But I think there's kind of a cycle of back to basics that you never move out of. So, I don't believe it is regression. I think it's just always revisiting your core purpose is probably how I would define back to basics.
Nick, briefly, you demonstrated some success with AI. What takeaway, what useful lesson would you share with our audience based on your experience?
It's not a silver bullet for everything. It's not going to solve every challenge that we've got, but it just gives us an opportunity to solve challenges quicker in the right place. So I think using it in different ways is fantastic, but don't try and implement AI just for the sake of it.
Right. And Colin, just before we wrap up, any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is here to stay, so we have to live in the world of AI. We can't ignore it. It's everywhere, both in terms of those that we regulate using it, and then our use of it as well. And in terms of regression back to basics, I think it's just about going back and looking at your first core principles or your first principles. So it's not necessarily regression. It's just checking that you're doing things as you were set up to do them, and if things have changed, then you make those changes.
That's great. I did notice that a number of other questions came in. I'm going to do a follow-up post on this presentation, so hopefully we'll get to address those in that. I'd encourage you all to check it out. And that brings us to the end of today's session. So a big thank you to our panelists, Nick, Colin, Karen. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your experience, your insights, and to Naomi and the Institute for their time and support. And thanks to everyone here for attending and taking part in the discussion. We hope it was a useful conversation. We hope it inspires some reflection to support you in your work in regulation. And on behalf of Objective RegWorks, we're proud to help keep regulatory professionals strengthening their practice and to deliver better outcomes. So keep an eye on your inbox for the webinar recording and follow-up resources. And I was going to take a moment to introduce you to the Modern Regulator and RegWorks. Modern Regulator, I discussed off the bat. I really encourage you to subscribe to it. You can use this QR code. We have a very useful monthly newsletter with all the updates in the world of regulation that have occurred in between the big bad headlines that none of us want to see, the sort of the good news of regulation, as it were. And then Objective RegWorks is a regulatory software purpose-built for regulators, and it helps regulators streamline processes, improve compliance outcomes, and stay focused on their core responsibilities. And it's already trusted by agencies across the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So thanks again, and we hope to see you all at a future session.
Thanks very much, all.